Today, I'm going to tell you a story of a lovely lady. Well, it has a lovely lady, but it's kind of about loyalty to your family, to God and country, and even the people you lead. This is a story that, if I don't tell it, it will be lost in time. It's a true story. We called him Dr. Thor. That wasn't his real name. It was easier for the rest of us, but he was a doctor and a psychiatrist. We were traveling together in the 1950s on a Norwegian ship bound for New York. We often played Scrabble, with some modifications. Dr. Thor played in Norwegian and German, while I did my best in French and English. It was obviously on the honor system, and we had a lot of fun. We talked of many things. He was on his way to the United States for some clinical studies, and asked many questions, especially about social changes since his last visit. He told of the Norwegian resistance during the Nazi invasion in the early 40s of the Nazis. Disappointment in the Vidkun Quisling's inability to lead his Norwegians into cooperation with the occupation, with the necessity of more German might in evidence, and Quisling only as their puppet. The Nazis made Dr. Thor the physician of the Central Mollengraten prison in Oslo. The prisoners were Norwegian resistors of the occupation of their homeland, but only a small part of them were there. Dr. Thor, with a wry smile, remarked that almost all Norwegians were in the underground against the Nazis, even the prison staff. With the German withdrawal from Norway before the final events of the war, the situation at the Oslo prison was reversed. Now the prisoners were Norwegians who had been duped by Quisling, and Dr. Thor was continued by his government as the physician of the prison. He was asked to have personal interview with each of the prisoners and recommend government action concerning them. The government followed his recommendations without exception. After the interviews, he said 85% of the prisoners who were youthful idealists caught up with Quisling's eloquence, go to your home and live in loyalty to your country. Don't let me hear of anything further against you. To the 10%, he said, you have been disloyal. Go and live now as a loyal Norwegian. Come back here in 6 months and tell me how you are doing. To the other 5%, he said, there is so much against you. You had better leave the country for at least 5 years. When you come back, report to us again. Of the 85%, Dr. Thor said there was not a further complaint against them. Of the 10%, all had been restored to full citizenship after their 6-month probation. And most of the 5% were now good citizens again. But among those in the prison, one was different. Major Vidkun Quisling, who had collaborated with the enemy. He had led others to do so, and had served the invaders as their support as Minister-President of Norway. He was tried by the Supreme Court and sentenced to die before a firing squad on October 24, 1945. Dr. Thor had many professional visits and talks with Major Quisling. As he told the story, he said he had never known a man of greater intellectual brilliance, nor had he known anyone so completely egotistical in his feeling of his infallibility. It was easy to see how his brilliance, eloquence, and self-confidence had swept some of the younger Norwegians off their feet. Nor is it difficult to see how his egotism, with the megalomaniac's privilege of changing his mind as he wished, had alienated him from his friends, associates, and allies, the enemy who wanted to use him and his fellow countrymen. One stayed with him, loyal and loving to the last, his wife. Maria was a White Russian of Orthodox Church, a devout Christian. They had met while Quisling was on a detached duty from the Norwegian army, serving in Russia and Eastern Europe in the rehabilitation of prisoners and refugees following the World War I. Maria was a loving person, younger than her husband. In his rise to power, his repudiation by his fellow citizens, his exaltation by the Nazis, and his fall, she had been faithful. If he had taken her counsel, his life would have been very different. But in his egotism, he was always right. Her advice was of no consequence. His co-workers were wrong if they differed from him. The votes of his fellow countrymen were wrong. The friendly offers of the Allies were dishonest. God was wrong when he did not agree with Quisling. Often in the days before the appointed execution, Maria came to the prison with tasty foods which her husband liked. Many times he refused to see her. When he did see her, he ate the food, but said no word to her. Late on the last evening of October 23rd, she came with her little basket of delicacies, but the superintendent of the prison said she could not be allowed in the cell. There might be poison or a weapon. It was not wise. Dr. Thor overheard the conversation and quietly offered to go into the cell with Mrs. Quisling and remain to make sure that all is well. It was agreed, and he took a seat at the far side of the cell. Then followed, said Dr. Thor, one of the most amazing experiences of my life. Quisling refused to recognize his wife's presence. He made no reply to her greeting and declined the delicacy she had brought. She continued to speak the love and kindness in her heart, and then was silent. Presently, he turned and looked at her. As their eyes met, he spoke her name. They began to converse. He tasted the good things in the basket. She spoke of God's love that never leaves us, of his compassion and forgiveness. I do not know, said Dr. Thor to me, the intricacies of theology, but in those 3 hours between 11 and 2 o'clock, Vidkun Quisling, the egotist, who was at war with himself, in contemptuous conflict with his fellow man, with his wife, and with his God, went out to meet the firing squad at peace with himself, and with his fellow men, with his wife, and with his God. He asked to shake the hands of each appointed executioner, assuring them they were doing their duty. He was responsible for bringing them here. In calmness he stood before them while the fatal shots were fired. But, Dr. Thor, I said, this story must be written as part of a record of a man who put a new word, Quisling, in the world's dictionary as a synonym of a foul puppet. What had happened in the final hours must be told. No, said Dr. Thor, not as long as Mrs. Quisling lives. March of 1980, when we were in Narvik, the headlines of the Norwegian press brought word of the death of Maria Quisling in Oslo at the age of 80.